in the next 2 hours, I'm going to give you some tips on how to read and write at a graduate level. I'm going to call this the Grad School Survival Skills Workshop. And what I'm really doing is giving you basic tips, almost like a field manual, survival guide for how to get through a graduate program in the most efficient way possible. In other words, I'm going to give you a lot of shortcuts, tips, things that, in a pinch, you can draw on these, and they should help you get through. And not only just get through, but do well. Okay, one of the first things you will have noticed is that I'm blind, so if you have any questions at any time, raising your hand will be highly ineffective, okay? So please, just call out, question, make sure I can hear you. You can interrupt me at any time, no problem at all, okay? What we're going to do first is talk about reading in the first hour, and the second we'll talk about writing. So on the reading section, both sections are going to follow the same kind of format. First, I'm going to give you some tips, things you might want to take notes on, suggestions, and then we're going to do a practical demonstration, both for the reading and for the writing. So I'm going to walk you through an article, which you should now have in front of you, and show you how to get through some material more quickly than by reading every word. But before we do any of that, let me start by asking if anybody saw the film Airplane, the old film Airplane from a long time ago. Good. Okay. Well, then you're going to do great in grad school. That's fine. We can go home now. Okay. Now, I want you to see if you remember, there's a scene when they're doing the news reporting, and this is in the Cold War era. And first, the Americans report on a fire in Moscow, and the newscaster says, a terrible fire raged through downtown Moscow today, leaving death and destruction in its wake. And then they show you the Soviet broadcast. And the Soviet commentator comes on and he says, "Good evening, comrades. Tonight, a glorious fire raged through downtown Moscow, clearing the way for a brand new tractor factory." Now, it was the same story, of course, but spun in a very different way. Why do you think I have started with this anecdote? Why do I bring this to you? What do you think that means about your reading in graduate school? Anybody? Throw out a thought.
I mean, there's numerous books written on the same topic, and everybody's got a different spin, so, you sometimes want to get different perspectives on it.
That's exactly right. Okay. So, as undergraduates, you're really reading for content. You're trying to absorb all the facts and the dates and the details. At the graduate level, you're reading more for thesis, which is the argument. What is it that the author is trying to say? So, as that person just said, you might have 20 different books about the origins of the French Revolution. But each one will have a different interpretation as to what that revolution meant, what it represented, and how it occurred, what the causal factors were. That's what you're reading for in grad school. You're looking for the thesis. What you're really on when you read in grad school is a search and destroy mission. You're searching for the thesis, and then you're trying to destroy it, meaning take it apart, take it down. So now I want to give you some tips on how to go through the search and destroy process and how you can more quickly and efficiently search for and find the author's thesis. Let's start with that. Okay, so number one, what's the first thing you normally look at when you pick up a book? Anybody? Cover, back of the book. Why the back of the book?
It's a summary.
It's a summary, right? Okay, you get a good summary sometimes. Yep. What else? Table of contents, yeah. Anybody else?
Title.
The title, okay. I'm going to suggest that the title is the most important thing you look at first and actually think about. Because titles are clues. When academics write, they're usually trying to convey an important message, often the thesis, not always, but often. The thesis, the main argument of the book, can be contained within that title. If it is, wow, what a tremendous shortcut. You don't even have to open the book, you'd think, right? Or at least that's your first step. If there's a book called, for example, Clash of Civilizations, that's a big clue as to what this book is going to be about. If the book says A History of Russia, it's not telling you that much. You'll be surprised at how often the title of the book tries to convey the thesis. Then you need to pay attention to the subtitle. That's also giving you clues about the thesis. And then you turn to the table of contents. Each chapter heading, each chapter title, and its subtitle is another clue about the main argument of that chapter. And usually, when you put them all together, they're building towards the author's main argument. So before you even sit and read a paragraph or a sentence in the book, you want to be priming yourselves to get ready to figure out what that author's thesis is. And you can do that by thinking about what the titles and subtitles and chapter titles mean. All right. The next thing I think you should do, number 2, is go straight to the conclusion. I don't recommend this with a mystery novel, but it's very helpful in academic reading. Because the conclusion, and usually I start with the very last paragraph, it will tell you, it should tell you, it doesn't always, but it should tell you exactly what the author wants to leave you with, the main idea that he's trying to argue, or she. So I'd go to your conclusion first, and then I'd try to restate it, what you read, in your own words. And I'm going to keep telling you this over and over again. Restate things in your own words. There's a lot of research to suggest that you learn much better and retain more when you can rephrase things in your own words and just write them down in condensed form. Okay. So that was actually number 3, is to state everything in your own words that you're reading. Tip number 4 is to go now and read the introduction for the first time. And you're going to find many more clues in the introduction. These are the 2 things that I would try to read more thoroughly. We're going to skim over other stuff, but make sure that you give a good, careful read to your conclusion and then your introduction, looking for clues to what the author's thesis is. And at that point, after the conclusion and the introduction, you probably will have a reasonably good idea. If you've thought about what's being written in the right way, you'll probably have a pretty good idea of what the thesis really is. Number 5, I would now start in on the text itself and read the topic sentences, in other words, the first sentence of each paragraph, and start skimming. Start skipping whole chunks, whole paragraphs. Now, I'm telling you this in the context of grad school survival skills. Don't leave here and say, Professor Short told us not to read anything that we were assigned. That's not what I'm saying. This is when you're in a pinch, and you don't have enough time, and you can't get through the whole thing. It would be great if you could read every word, although it's not always necessary. The main thing is that you get the important stuff. And so your first question is probably, well, what if I skip something important? And the answer is, well, you might. But the more you do this, the better you will get at figuring out what the important paragraphs are and figuring out what the unimportant ones or less important ones are and how to skip over those. We're going to do all of this in a demonstration in a moment. Okay. Then finally, 6, after I've skimmed through, skipped over the paragraphs that seem like they're more background or they're just re-emphasizing the point I already got from a previous paragraph, then I'd go back to the conclusion and I'd reread it and restate it again in my own words what I think the thesis is and see if my thinking has changed at all after having done that reading process. Okay. Those are your basic quick tips. In a moment, we can go through an actual article. Any questions before we do that? Anybody want to ask a quick question? Feel free. Shout out question if you have one. No? Okay. Great. All right. That was all about how to search for the thesis. Let's talk for a little bit about how to destroy and what it means to critique an article. If I'm going to tell you how to critique an article, the first thing you have to know is what a critique is not. And this is something that a lot of officers and grad students have a hard time understanding when they first start grad school. A critique is not, I thought the book was boring, or the font was too small, or something that's just a complaint about the article or the book. A critique is an analysis of the thesis, its strengths and its weaknesses. A critique is an analysis of the argument, which is the thesis, its strengths and its weaknesses. Now, how do you get to do that? How do you figure out how to take something apart? Let me offer some suggestions on how to do that. And I should just add that although I said it's a search and destroy mission, one aspect of the critiquing process is also to say what's strong about the article or the book, not just what's wrong with it. So let's start out here. First thing you can do is to identify all the assumptions in the article. So now that you've written down the thesis in your own words and you've got a fairly good idea of what the author's trying to say, make a list of all the assumptions implicit in that argument. For example, how about our Soviet tractor factory case? What are the examples? Let's say we were going to take that and imagine it were a text, that report that a glorious fire raged through downtown Moscow today, clearing the way for a brand new tractor factory. What are all the assumptions implicit in that presentation? Anybody? Throw out one.
That was intentional.
That the fire was intentional. Exactly. Very good. That's one. What else?
That there will be a tractor factory.
That there will be a tractor factory. Good. Anything else?
Nothing of value was lost.
That nothing of value was lost. Good. Okay.
Fire was under control.
That the fire was under control. Good. Okay. I think you get the point. You can go on, start picking out these assumptions. Then you need to question them. So let's say it's that a tractor factory was being planned. Well, if you're a scholar, you're going to investigate that claim. You're going to say, all right, can we find any records that there were plans in the works? Did they have the money for it? Was the money set aside? On and on. This is how you start to do a critique. Okay, good. Now, what you're really doing, let me just put that as point number 2, is you're asking if each assumption is valid and whether it's sound, whether it's supported by the evidence. Okay? So 1 is to list all the assumptions. 2 is to ask if each assumption is valid. The third is to ask if the conclusion reached logically follows from the premises. This is just basic logic exercise. Okay? And then 4, you want to ask if there were alternative interpretations. Are alternative interpretations plausible? In other words, is it possible that the fire was not planned and that it was an accident and there's some other, even more plausible explanation? Okay. Then, number 5, ask if there is empirical data that might contradict the conclusion or any of the premises. So first we're challenging the logic, and then we're questioning the empirics. The difference being the logic is whether C follows from premises A and B. In other words, if I said a triangle has 4 sides, you'd know immediately, you wouldn't need any data, you'd know immediately that that's wrong. It's logically impossible. Empirics are the information that we have to disprove something, such as the evidence that the French Revolution occurred, that it occurred in 1789, and so on. Okay. Let's talk for a moment about what a strong and a weak critique would really be. So, a cheap critique you'll find everywhere. And they usually follow the basic form of the author didn't do this or that. And they're easy to do because, by definition, a book or an article is a bounded project, and you cannot cover everything. So you often find people saying, well, this book on South Africa was really good, but the author didn't talk about Ghana. Well, it had nothing to do with Ghana. So they're just looking for ways of critiquing. That's not a very sound or useful critique. What you could ask instead is, if something is omitted, is it essential to the subject? So if we did a book on Thomas Edison's invention of the light bulb, and we said, you know, we never mentioned the phonograph, that might be kind of important to the subject, because it was critical to who he was and what he did. Okay, I think you get the point there. What's a strong critique? A strong critique is one that exposes internal contradictions in the author's arguments, and it also brings us to new insights that not everyone would have had. So that's what you're aiming for when you give a class presentation or when you're writing a paper, when you're reading a text. You're trying to figure out what is it that the author has missed or has contradicted himself in. That would be a very strong critique. Okay, any questions on any of this before we do the actual demonstration? Questions? Anybody? No? Good. Okay, great. why don't we turn to this handout, and I'm going to need some volunteers from the audience to be readers. Let's take a look at this. Who wants to be a reader and read out loud for us just a little bit? And we'll switch off. We'll have a couple different people do this. Anybody? Who has a good, clear speaking voice?
I'll read.
Okay, great. All right. What's your name?
Doug?
Doug. Okay, good. Let's take our lessons, our tips that we started with, and go from there. So let's turn first to the title, the very first thing. What is it?
Chapter 2, The Coming of the First World War.
Okay. Anybody now? What does that mean to you when you hear that? What does the title suggest to you? Exactly. Okay. Well, that was easy. Right. Very good. And what clued you into that? The word reassessment. So there was your big clue right there. Now you're primed and ready to know that something about the coming of the First World War is going to be reassessed. We don't know what yet, but at least we're primed and ready that something's coming. Now I would suggest looking at subtitles, and since this is a chapter, an article from a book, let's run through, skim through, and see what the subheadings are, if there are any. You won't always find them, but when you do, they can be useful clues. So let's hear, Doug, you want to give us what the next, or what the first subheading is?
All right, the first one is Fisher thesis.
Okay. Let's say we've never heard of the Fisher thesis. Okay, we have no idea who Fisher was. What might you guess that section could be about? It's going to tell us, obviously, what the Fisher thesis is. We know that the title of the chapter is The Coming of the First World War, a Reassessment. So what do you think the author's likely to suggest?
Establishing whatever is considered the common knowledge.
Yes, very good guess. Okay, absolutely. All right. Next, what's the next subheading, Doug? The rigidity of military plans. Okay. Take a guess. What might the author be talking about here? What might he be trying to suggest, knowing that he's trying to do a reassessment? What do you think? This is a little harder.
Maybe they weren't as rigid as commonly viewed.
That's one possibility. Yeah. Okay. Okay, that's another possibility, that the plans were inflexible before the war began, but maybe not afterwards. Okay, we're not sure yet. We don't know yet. But we're going to guess that something's going to be reassessed, maybe old thinking is going to be overturned, that's all we know. And there's probably going to be something to be reassessed about this idea that military plans were rigid. Okay, what's the next one? Cult of the offensive. Any guesses on this? We're just guessing at this point. We're trying to prime ourselves. Okay, so that there was some idea of offensive strategy involved, okay, and maybe that's going to be reassessed. Now remember, let's think back to our title, The Coming of the First World War, a reassessment. Now you know that most of history and political science involves a search for causation, for causal links. Why did the Soviet Union collapse? Why did the French Revolution occur? Why are some countries rich when others are poor? And then we try and understand what might the factors be that caused or are causing X condition or Y event, right? So now we have an event, the coming of the First World War, and now we're going to reassess that, and we're looking at different sections that might cover possibly causal explanations for the coming of the First World War. Okay, good. What's our next one?
Mobilization plans and preemption.
Okay. Again, I think we're getting the idea here. He's probably going to reassess something about the idea of mobilization plans. Okay, next one. Is that a subheading? Sounds like it might be. I don't know. But okay, it's going to give us more about mobilization. Fine, let's jump ahead. Next. Okay, let's keep going. So we're going to break it down. We're going to look at all the aspects of mobilization as causal explanations. Sorry? The final hours. Okay, we're at the prelude to the war. Good. Keep going. That's a section title we like to find. Okay, you won't always find it. When you get it, you know what straight to go to. What I usually do is I look ahead at the conclusion. I see how many paragraphs it is or how many pages just to get a sense of how much I need to read first. Can you tell me how many pages that is? About 5 pages? Okay. So that's what I'd start with, and that's what I think we should turn to now. So we're primed. We have a sense of what the article is going to do, that it's going to challenge the conventional thinking, and it's going to break down different causal explanations for the coming of the First World War. Okay. Would anybody else like to read, or anybody else want to give it a shot?
I'll go ahead and read.
Who's that?
Roman.
Roman. Okay, great. All right. Let's start with the final paragraph of the conclusion first, as I suggested at the outset. Let's read it out loud and start thinking about what each sentence means. Okay, go ahead.
During this whole process, the interpretation was accepted because people wanted to believe.
Okay, stop, slow down, not so fast. All right, now, here's where we really want to take our time. All the rest we've been skimming and jumping through. Now we want to sink our teeth into it and figure out what each sentence means, okay? Let's hear that sentence again, a little louder.
During this whole process, this interpretation was accepted because of what people wanted to believe.
Okay, somebody tell me what that sentence means to you. What is the author trying to say? Means you should read the last paragraph, okay. But keep going. What is he suggesting here in just this one sentence?
The traditional interpretation of what caused World War I was accepted because it's what people wanted to believe, not necessarily for the reason, but just what is common knowledge.
Exactly right. Okay, who was that? Gary. Okay, Gary, G-A-R-Y? Okay, great, excellent, okay. Let's do the next sentence. Roman?
It is important, however, that our basic thinking about issues of war and peace not be allowed to rest on what are in the final analysis simply myths about the past.
Okay, let's put that sentence in our own words. Anybody?
Sounds like he's kind of reframing his justification versus reassessment here.
Okay, good. Reframing. Anybody else? Right, okay. In other words, there are facts that we can discover, and we should not base our understanding of the coming of the First World War, the origins of the First World War, the causes of the First World War, should not be based on myths. It should be based on facts. Good, okay. Roman?
The conventional wisdom does not have to be accepted on faith alone. Claims about the past can always be translated into historically testable propositions.
Put it in your own words. Anybody?
Basically saying that, question and test what you're being told.
Exactly.
So take face value, what people are saying, and process.
That's pretty much lesson number 1 of academia. Okay? Question what you're being told. Okay, good. Is there more? Okay.
In this case, when one actually tests these propositions against the empirical evidence, which for the July crisis is both abundant and accessible, one is struck by how weak most of the arguments around it.
Okay, good. Put it in your own words. And when you do, try to cut out the parenthetic phrases and get to the meat of it, because that was a longer sentence. What's the heart of this sentence?
There's plenty of evidence that contradicts the original.
Yes, right. There's ample evidence to contradict the standard interpretation. Good. Is that the end? One more?
The
Okay.
most remarkable thing about all these claims to support the conclusion about events moving quote-unquote out of control in 1914 is how little basis in fact they actually have.
Good. Okay, I think it's pretty clear by now. Anybody want to summarize that last sentence? Anybody?
None of the empirical evidence, none of the empirical data that justifies
Justify what? Not enough data to justify what?
the causes.
The traditional interpretation of the causes. Right, okay. So the standard thinking, when you really test it, when you look for the evidence, there really isn't that much there to support the standard interpretation. Okay, good. Now you've only read a title, subtitles, and a final paragraph of an article, and you have a pretty good idea of what the thesis is, a real reassessment of the traditional thinking. Now let's see if we can get a little bit deeper. Let me get a quick time check. Somebody tell me what time it is? What do we got? What time? 13:30. Okay, good. All right, let's now move to the start of the conclusion. Roman, do you want to keep going?
Sure.
Okay, great. Let's tackle now the first paragraph of the conclusion.
Okay. The aim here was not to offer yet another interpretation of the coming of the First World War.
Sort of light up when I hear a sentence like that. Somebody want to summarize that? I keep pushing you to put it in your own words because we know that when you do that, it really helps it to stick in your mind and helps you to understand. Have you ever had the experience, by the way, where you're reading and you're turning pages and you're reading and suddenly you sort of snap out of this stupor and you're like, wait a minute, what did I just read for the last 20 minutes? I have no idea what just happened. Aha, right. That tells me that you have. That occurs because you're reading passively. And what I'm trying to teach you is how to read actively. When you stop after each sentence and rephrase it in your own words and think, what does this mean? How can I rephrase this? That's when you read actively. You will never again have that experience of what was I just reading, because you will be actually actively focusing on what it means and thinking about it, and you will learn it so much better. And here's the big payoff. You will also remember it much, much better. Okay. All right, so that sentence, we were going to summarize that. The aim here was not to do something. What was it not to do?
Not to offer yet another interpretation of the coming of the First World War.
Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. So he's not going to offer his own interpretation. Go on.
This was instead meant mainly as an exercise in intellectual housekeeping.
Okay. Intellectual housekeeping, nice phrase. What does he mean? Let's keep going.
There are many claims about the origins of the war that have been accepted more or less uncritically, and the goal here was to test some of the more important ones against the evidence.
Okay. So this article is about testing existing interpretations and seeing if they hold up. That's how I'd rephrase it. Okay? Any more to that paragraph?
What was at stake was not simply our historical understanding of this particular episode. It was really because so much of our thinking today about issues of strategy and foreign policy rests in such large measure on a specific interpretation of the July crisis that an effort of this sort was worth undertaking.
Now that's a pretty long sentence, but something tells me that there's something meaningful here. And I'm going to tell you why. Let's say I knew nothing about this. I mean, I do this every day. I take a book that I've never read before, and I go through the same process that we're doing now, and I have sort of conditioned myself to have flags and lights go off, and when I get to a sentence that tells me something different is being said here, something else is happening here. Who wants to summarize what this sentence might be about? Putting in your own words. It's a little tougher.
Just that so much of our theory related to foreign relations and war is based on this one understanding of the start of World War I.
Exactly.
If you reevaluate that, then you have to reevaluate.
That's exactly what he's saying. Right. In other words, our thinking about strategy and the causes of wars in general comes very much, or has been very much affected by, our understanding of the causes of World War I. So if the causes of World War I, if we've misunderstood that, then maybe we misunderstand certain fundamental things about strategy in war. Okay, good. Let's keep going.
That's the end of that paragraph.
Okay, great. All right. We could do this now with each paragraph of the conclusion, summarize it, read through it like we've been doing, and I think you'd be in good shape to get a lot out of it. Let's just take a few more minutes and do something similar with the introduction. Because after I'm done with the conclusion, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the rest of the conclusion, but you would do it on your own. And now, for didactic purposes, let's go to the beginning and start with the title, subtitle, and the introduction. We'll read the first paragraph. Somebody want to take over from Roman? Anybody else? Who's that?
Henri.
What's your name?
Henri.
Henri? Okay, great.
The idea that a great war need not be the product of deliberate decision, but it can come because statesmen lose control of events is one of the most basic and most common notions to war and law.
Okay, very long sentence. Let's break it down and figure out what this means. Now, before this process, you might have started out by reading the first sentence of the article, and you'd be hit with this, and you might not be so clear on where it's going. But I think you're now better primed to understand what the sentence is about. Let's break it down. Anybody want to summarize it?
Well, it almost
Nice and loud.
It almost sounds like you're saying the war is not a decisive decision. You just don't say, I'm going to war. Basically, because of all the factors surrounding events, it occurs. That's how.
Okay. You know what? It was so long, I need to hear it again. So let's do it one more time.
The
All right?
idea that a great war need not be the product of deliberate decision.
Okay. I got to take things in chunks. That's just how my mind works. I can't absorb it all at once. So I'll summarize that. The idea that a great war, what was it? Need not be...
Product of deliberate decision.
Okay. Need not be deliberate. Okay.
That it can come because statesmen lose control of events.
The idea that a war can come because statesmen lose control of events. Uh-huh.
Is one of the most basic and most common notions in contemporary American strategic thought.
Okay. So that's pretty much a basic idea. In strategic thought, we assume that a statesman can lose control of events and wars can happen when things get out of control. Okay, next sentence.
A crisis, it is widely assumed, might unleash forces of an essentially military nature that overwhelm the political process and bring on a war that nobody wants.
Somebody want to summarize that in just a few words? Really pare it down. Severe crises can lead to unintentional wars. Okay, right, good. Let me just hear it one more time to make sure.
A crisis, it is widely assumed, might unleash forces of an essentially military nature that overwhelm the political process and bring on a war that nobody wants.
Okay, so there's an assumption that wars can happen when no one wants them, and a crisis could bring it on. Okay, good. Next sentence.
Many important conclusions about the risk of nuclear war and thus about the political meaning of nuclear forces rest on this fundamental idea.
Aha. Okay. What's new in that sentence? In this article about... Yes, right, okay. So in this article about the coming of the First World War, suddenly he's talking about nuclear war. Okay, I don't know much about history, but I don't think nukes were around in World War I, so what's he talking about here? Summarize that sentence for me.
It's just putting it into a more modern, these conclusions relate directly to situations today.
Yes, okay. Now, I don't know if once something like that happens in an article, and I would have done this before, but I didn't want to overwhelm you with information at the start, I usually, when I'm looking at the title and the author, I look also at the publisher and the copyright date. I want to make sure I know when it was done, so I can think what is the context in which this book or article was written. I don't know if the date of publication is on the handout I've given you. Is it?
Yeah, winter 1990.
Winter 1990. Okay, great. Which means that the author was probably writing it a few years before, 88, 89, might have started in 87, who knows. Okay. So now you start to think, okay, what was happening at that time that would be on this guy's mind, and that relates to nuclear warfare, and you think about the Cold War and rising tensions, and you can see how that might be the background to what he's trying to say. Okay, let's do the next sentence. We're still in that first paragraph?
No, this is the next paragraph.
Okay, let's just do one more. Let's start the next paragraph.
This theory of inadvertent war is in turn rooted to a quite extraordinary degree in a specific interpretation of a single historical episode, the coming of the First World War during the July crisis in 1914.
Okay, somebody put that in just a few words?
We have this theory that's based on one specific event.
Right, exactly. Okay. And based on all that we've been talking about, we know he's going to say that that theory doesn't really hold up. And so now we can surmise that the rest of the article is going to be an attempt to take apart the prevailing theories and show that they don't hold up. The sentence you just read me, that first sentence of the second paragraph, is that what it was?
Yes.
Okay. That, if I were highlighting, I'd probably highlight that one. And I advise you to highlight as little as you possibly can. You should have, if you use a highlighter, or whatever method you use, do it to the bare minimum so that you just get the main points. And that sentence jumps out at me is probably one of the main points, because we know that only because we've gone through this process. We read the subtitles, we went to the conclusion, we had a sense of what the argument is, and now we see it again in the introduction. Okay, if you follow these steps with everything you read in academic context, you will find that it's not always possible, but more often than not, you can get through these things much more quickly and get to the author's thesis much more quickly than if you just tried to read straight through and if you read passively. Try to read actively, put things in your own words, and you will retain it much, much better. Questions about what we've just done?
When you're doing this, typically do you recommend taking notes for classes, or just kind of highlighting? How do you work?
Yeah, excellent question. I would write things down because, again, a lot of research into learning tells us that the different ways in which you articulate material, the better you will retain it and understand it. So writing it down in your own words is one way. So I would open up a separate computer screen. If I'm reading something, I'd write notes on Trachtenberg coming of First World War, or World War I, whatever the title. And then I'd put thesis, colon, and then in a single sentence, what I think the thesis is. And then I might even put see page, blah, blah, paragraph 1, or whatever, or the thing that I've highlighted, or I have something that would link me to that. If I had an electronic form, I might copy and paste the key sentence like some of these. Saying it out loud is another way that helps you remember. Singing it, acting it out, doesn't matter, whatever, any way of articulating it in some other form and multiple forms, if you have to study and remember something, that is a really good way to remember. Good question. Other questions?
As far as the author who's writing an article or book, how far should you go looking at who this individual is? I mean, usually in the book they have a quick blurb about who they are.
Great question. Great question. Okay. So we can always go deeper, and I've just given you the very beginning and the very basics on how to do this. A next step is to try and figure out which school of thought the author falls into, and that will help you to place the work even before you begin. So one thing that, as you get more advanced in this type of thing, one thing you'll do is read the acknowledgments. That is one of the first things that many academics do. And the reason for reading the acknowledgments, it's not, I'd like to thank my husband or wife, it's, I'd like to thank these scholars who were influential in shaping my views. And as you become more familiar with the different schools of thought, then you know, he falls into the X camp, the functionalist camp, or the intentionalist camp, or the whatever it might be. So that will come later as you learn what the different schools of thought are in a particular subfield or issue. Good question. So yeah, I would spend a little bit of time researching the author's background, who he thanks, who he's been influenced by, or she, and try to get some sense of where they stand from that. Good. Other questions? Okay. All right. Why don't we let's have Professor Jaskoski add some things. Good.
I just wanted to add, I'm also a professor in NSA with Dr. Shore. I wanted to add just a little bit more on search and destroy. Search and destroy is not always about, well, let me say this. Critical reading is not all about destroying the author's argument. And I just wanted to expand a little bit more on concepts, causal arguments, case selection. These are kind of three things you can look at as you're reading critically. It will help guide you in your reading. It'll give you something to say in class. And I actually think there's some practical use for this kind of reading in general, not just in academia. In terms of concepts, you might ask as you're reading, you come across a concept that an author's talking about. Ask how it relates to other outcomes in that reading, other concepts in that reading, other concepts that you're studying in the class. And so I was discussing with a dissertation student the concept of self-defense groups that are kind of formed to defend against insurgency. So we got to talking, and the question comes up, what's the difference between that self-defense group and the insurgency? Okay, how are self-defense groups different from paramilitary groups? And we got to talking about self-defense groups that last a long time. At what point are they not self-defense groups and they become their own insurgency or their own paramilitary group? If a self-defense group is funded by the state, is it a self-defense group? Okay, how's a self-defense group different from a revolutionary movement? And so we got to talking about all these concepts and how they relate to one another. And he found it helpful not just in thinking for his dissertation, but also in terms of his actual next assignment. So think about kind of distinctions among different concepts and what distinctions are useful and important for the goals of the class, for the goals of the reading, and for your goals as a writer, which we'll get to in the second part. Another thing, one more note on concepts. Ask, is the author measuring the concept well? Or are there alternative ways to measure it? Maybe it's not a right or wrong question, but a different measurement kind of question. And if we measure the concept in a different way, will it affect the conclusions of the article or the book that you're reading? So one example I like to turn to is the question of a liberal market economy or a free market economy. What if you're reading the piece and the author talks about private ownership as opposed to the state? Okay, private ownership, and talking about low tariff rates to kind of help this liberal market or free market economy. But what if he leaves out the question of whether or not monopolies exist? Okay, and maybe you look into this case because you know the country and you say, actually, there are a lot of monopolies. There's not real competition. Can I really call that a liberal market economy or a free market? Okay, so there's different ways to measure concepts, and I think it's important to be attuned to the different alternatives and how those measures can affect the conclusions of the article. One note on causal analysis. This is just building on something Dr. Shore talked about in terms of schools. You know, you're gonna read a book. You're gonna find out what school of thought an author is from. And I just wanted to highlight there's a real useful. There's something very useful about figuring out the school of thought. Essentially, you're finding, does this author think that structure matters? For instance, is the author focused on structural factors in society, a large poor class or a large wealthy industrial class? Is he focused on things like socioeconomic structural factors? If as you read literatures, you find out, well, what is structure, and you recognize it and you say, okay, I'll put him in that camp. Someone else is focused on rational individuals making choices and why rational individuals making choices might come together in a social movement when it's easier to free ride. Okay, questions of, so if they begin with rationality, that's a different place to start than great poor classes in a society. So there's kind of an academic exercise there. There's also kind of a very practical piece to it that I wanted to highlight. You're looking out in the world, you're making plans, you're making policy plans perhaps. What if you're focused entirely on the question of culture, maybe religion, okay, but you're not focused on state institutions or poverty in a society, or what would the rational peasant do in that scenario? You might actually be omitting major pieces of what's going on and what a solution might look like. And then one quick example like on that, which I just love, the State Department decided, this is something I read in the newspaper several years ago. The State Department decided they wanted to deter poor Peruvian peasants from growing coca. Okay, this is part of the U.S. war on drugs. We want to somehow replace the coca crop, which can be made into cocaine, with something else. So the U.S. State Department decides asparagus. Okay, so they're going to subsidize asparagus in Peru so these peasants can make money off of asparagus and get out of the drug trade. It all sounds reasonable. Thinking about poverty, a structural factor, rational peasants making strategic choices about what crop they're going to grow to be able to support their family. Okay, so it all looks kind of good. State Department subsidizes asparagus in Peru. What happens? Well, asparagus does not grow in the highlands where the coca grows and where the poor peasants are. Asparagus grows very nicely on the coast of Peru. So asparagus takes off in Peru as a crop. Asparagus growers in Peru are competing with U.S. asparagus growers, which hurts the U.S. asparagus growers. And in the meantime, the coca growers are continuing to grow their coca crop because they couldn't grow asparagus even if they wanted to where they live. Okay, so wouldn't it have been nice had the State Department taken into consideration the question of geography, topography, climate? Okay, a big category of factors that was left out. So there's real practical reasons for thinking, where does this scholar fit? What might he be leaving out? And what might complement his argument? And finally, I just wanted to comment real quick on cases. You're reading about, you're reading the author writing on a war. two revolutions, a country that's left-leaning and non-democratic, or whatever he's writing about, how does he justify his case selection? Okay, he or she, and are they biased in some way? So, again, a Latin America example: Venezuela is under a left-leaning government, criticized by some for being non-democratic, for cracking down on freedom of speech. If you read an article about Venezuela and several other left-leaning governments that look non-democratic to the author, you might step back and say, well, why are they all left-leaning governments? What about right-leaning governments? Could they also be categorized as non-democratic according to his kind of his kind of schema? So that's just, pay attention to the case selection, and authors should justify what cases they're looking at and why they're not looking at other cases. So those are just some more kind of pieces to critical thinking and critical reading as you search and destroy.
Great. Okay, yeah, so when I said earlier that it's a cheap critique to say what the author left out, the caveat is if they left out something critical, that's extremely important. So that's what you need to be focused on. Okay, why don't we take a quick 10-minute break. When we come back, we'll talk about writing and strategies for writing better. Okay, take 10. Thanks. Centered here.
Yeah, right over where I am is probably center, right in front of the desk here.
Unless I was far too far.
You're a little bit over there, yeah, yeah. And they're pretty spread. They're a little bit heavier on that side in terms of the distribution. So, okay. So I'm going to just sit right here if that's not distracting. No, you're fine. You're fine.
I'll just give a little space.
I just wanted to warn you. Okay.
Okay, welcome back. Part 2 about writing. Thanks for coming. Let me ask first if there are any questions about what we did before. Anybody have any questions about the reading stuff?
Yes. I had one question concerning the practice of active reading, and my question has to do with the footnotes at the bottom of the page. I know that oftentimes what you have tucked away in those footnotes are sort of all off the background, but I don't know as an active reader whether it's worth my time to look into it right away or later. You know what I'm saying?
I do. Okay, your question is about the footnotes and how do you know when to look up each footnote and spend time weighing through them? And I think that the answer is once you've zeroed in on the paragraphs and the sections that are most important to you, when you've decided, okay, I can skip over this, skip over that, that's all background, and I would zeroed in on the most important stuff. When the footnotes are in there, then I would take a look at them, and depending on how much time you have, yeah, I would use them as important clues. There can be good information found in footnotes. I'm a historian by training. I live and die by footnotes. They're our most important things, so I would never tell you to dismiss them. It's a question of how much time you have, and I would say for efficiency's sake, just do the ones, when you're pressed for time, that are in the sections most critical to you, okay? Other questions? If not, then let's start out talking about writing by asking you why you think Tiger Woods has been so successful in golf, not necessarily in other areas, but in golf. Practice is what most people would say. You're right. And he certainly does practice. He loves it. He has a lot of passion for it. All true. Natural ability. Some people believe he has a natural ability. Others dispute that and say it's all about practice, and he has some natural ability, but gets to a greater level of achievement because of intense practice. Anything else?
He started young.
Started young. Okay, that certainly helps. All these things are true. Say again, I'm sorry.
Meaningful practice, not just about getting out there and hitting the ball, about practicing what needs to be practiced in a good way, like perfect practice.
That's right. He practices smart. He doesn't just practice a lot. And by that, I mean he learned at a certain point that his stroke was good, but not good enough, and that there was a better, more efficient way to do what he was doing. His swing could have been improved. And so he actually took the time to unlearn all the habits he had built up over years and started afresh so that he could get this better swing. It was an intense effort. The point is that he unlearned bad habits, and that really benefited him. In the same way, I'm going to suggest that a lot of people have learned bad habits in writing, and what you often need to do is break those down and unlearn them and start afresh. Here's my attempt at a few tips, ways that may help you look at your writing anew. I'm just going to give you a few points, and again, all I'm offering you is one way to think about your writing of essays and research papers and exam questions. There's so many ways to do this, it would be such a boring written world if everybody wrote in the same way. But here's just some tips to think about, ways that might be useful to you. You could try them out. Okay. The metaphor I want to use is that you should write like a boxer, meaning that you have efficient moves with a plan. You don't just go out flailing. Some people, when you read their work, it feels like they've taken a bucket of words and just spilled them onto the computer screen. And they don't really know, is that you? That's most of us, okay? It happens until you really start crafting what you're doing. Most people don't start out with a plan, and so that is the number one thing I would say. Start out with a strategy for how you want to get to the end point. You need to know where it is you want to lead the reader. You have to have your thesis in mind when you're ready to write. You want to know what you're arguing. You've got to figure out, how do I get the reader there? An outline is helpful. That's not the only thing. You can roadmap things as you go along. You're really trying to lead the reader by the hand. And remember that what's totally clear in your own head may be utterly confusing to everyone else. You have to make sure that you can communicate clearly. And here are some ways to do that. So let's start with you need to come out swinging when you write. In other words, state your thesis in the first sentence, or at least in the first paragraph. Now, not everyone does this, and again, these are not hard and fast rules. But my advice is that it will be easier for you, at least when you start, to get it there in the first sentence or first paragraph. Know what it is you want to say, crisp and clean. Get it in the first sentence if you can. All right? That will help you to come out swinging. That means you're really letting us know, here's what it is I'm going to do. And we don't have to guess. We don't have to wonder. So many times writing is meandering, and we sit there thinking, what is this person trying to say? Don't make us wait. Hit us with it right away. And that thesis statement should have three elements to it, at least. It should be crisp, lucid, and defensible. By crisp, I mean it should be brief. Use as few words as possible. By lucid, it has to be comprehensible to people outside of your head. So my advice is that you read it to a friend, a spouse, a child, anyone. Make sure that they understand what it is you're trying to say, at least in your thesis statement. And then it has to be defensible. You don't want to come up with an argument that might be really great, but you can't support it, you can't back it up. So those are the three main things that your thesis must be: crisp, lucid, and defensible. There's more, of course, but those are three essential elements. Okay. The third thing I would say is that you need to make your first punch really count. And to do that, you need to list all of the evidence that would support the argument you're making. So I would get out a separate sheet or separate screen and make a list of all the points that will support your argument. And then, this is just a suggestion, you lead with your second strongest piece of evidence. In other words, it'll be a very powerful piece of evidence that's persuasive, and when the reader comes in contact with this right away, early on in your essay, they say, oh, wow, well, that is persuasive. The rest of the essay will start mounting up more of the pieces of evidence to persuade them. Okay. Then, number 4, I would say, execute by battering the reader with lucid, muscular prose. That means the fewer words, the better. Concision is key. They've done studies on who are the most effective and successful writers. not in literature, of course, but in nonfiction. And they find that the fewer words per sentence, the more effective that person can be. Malcolm Gladwell is one of the most popular writers of the day, and computer analysis of the sentences in his major works find that they run about an average of 26 words per sentence, something like that. Many of them having far fewer, because that's just an average. So bear that in mind. Try to keep it pared down. Number 5, parry counter-arguments. Because if you don't, you will get knocked down. They will knock down your argument. Your professors, reading the papers you give them, are always thinking, well, what about this? What about that? As Professor Jaskoski was just describing, we're always thinking, well, have they considered this other factor or that other condition? You need to confront those head-on and deflect them, either by arguing your case for why your points are more valid, make more sense than the counter-arguments, or by saying the other counter-arguments are true, but they're not relevant to what I'm trying to say. So you can deflect counter-arguments by saying they're actually irrelevant to the argument you're making. That's one approach. Okay, and then 6, you want to finish strong. You want to finish with a knockout punch. And in that case, I would say your conclusion should probably, or one way of doing it, is that you could bring in now your strongest piece of evidence to support your argument. I told you to lead with your second strongest. That's just a suggestion. Here you could now conclude with your strongest piece. Imagine that you were a prosecuting attorney in a murder trial, and you were summing up your case and saying, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, not only was the defendant seen coming from the murdered man's home the night of the crime, and not only did he stand to inherit $10 million, but we also now have run the DNA analysis of the blood on the knife that killed the man, and we find it matches exactly the defendant. Case closed. That would be a very strong and persuasive knockout punch. You want to try and have that same effect with the arguments you make in your writing. Okay. Let me ask if there are any questions about this first before we turn to other things. Any questions? No? Okay. Sorry. I drift sometimes. I apologize. Okay. Yeah, please. Go ahead.
Sometimes the profession limits minimum requirement on pages.
Good.
Now,
Yeah.
I found myself, stating what I need to state with non-word remedy. Then, you're trying to get to that magical page, and you put more information. What kind of recommendations do you have?
I have a lot. Okay. And it's actually the topic of a separate lecture about filling the white space. Is that what you're asking me? How do I fill that white space? Oh, boy. I didn't have time for it, and I wasn't planning on doing it today. I wonder if I can... all right, well, I'll tell you what we'll do. Let me, after we do the writing samples, and then we turn it over to Professor Jaskoski, we'll see if we have time, and then I'll give you some more tips on that. And if we don't, then at the very end, come see me, and I'll give you some. But it sounds like a lot of people would like that. Is that true? Okay, it sounded like a lot of people would like that. So let me see if I can work that in by the end. We're going to try not to run over the hour, but we'll see. Okay, good question. I'll try to get to it. Other questions? Okay, great question. Passive voice, just so everyone knows, here's active. I throw the ball. Passive voice, the ball was thrown by me. Suppose you told your sweetheart, much love is had by me for you. How would that go over? Probably not so well, right? I love you is a much stronger, more powerful active voice statement. I strongly recommend it. I'd stay away from the passive voice as much as possible. You can't always, sometimes it's necessary, but usually it isn't. So I would make an effort to keep it active. It's much more interesting to read, more fun to write as well. Other questions?
What about like first person or referring to the paper, like this paper will prove? Is that sophomoric or is that?
Look, when I was in In elementary school, they told me never to use I. Now I'm an adult, and I use I all the time. I realized I can do whatever I want. And I like using I, and I think it's more persuasive and effective. I start to glaze over when I read, this paper will show that blah, blah. Everyone does it. I'm not going to tell you it's wrong. It's not wrong. It's perfectly acceptable. It's typical academic writing. You can do it. I just think it's more interesting to say, I will show, I will argue. I think that works much better. Good question.
You just got to kind of feel like your professor then, 'cause some of
Yeah. Oh, great. Oh, know your audience is number one. Yeah, absolutely. If your professor has some problem with that, I strongly recommend stick to the boring passive voice and make it as dull as possible, if that's going to help you, okay? Know your audience, okay? All right, good. Other questions? On the idea of stating your thesis right up front, before you go to filling the white space, here's like a little tidbit that will hint at the answer to your question about filling the white space. Try to use the Columbo principle. Anybody ever see the old detective show Columbo with Peter Falk? Anybody ever see that? Guy with the rumpled raincoat and the cigar, solve these murder mysteries. Anybody? No? A few people? I was going to do an imitation, but now it will be lost because no one's seen it, so I won't do it. Well, just for a second, yeah. He would say.
See a show of hands? We've got like 8.
8 people, it's not worth doing. Too bad. Oh, you're missing a great interview. I guess I could do it, and everyone would believe me that that's exactly what the guy sounded like. Anyway, what happened in the TV show Columbo is that unlike other murder mysteries, where it was always this build-up and you never knew who done it until the very end, when there's this revelation and the detective says, all the suspects are gathered in one room, and Agatha Christie or whoever it is says, the murderer is, and points to. In the Columbo show, you know who the murderer is in the first minute or two of the show. They show you the murder taking place. And the rest of the show is about how Columbo, the detective, figures it out. That's what your academic writing should really be like. Don't make us guess and wait to know what it is you're trying to argue until the very end. Tell us right at the beginning, here's what I discovered, and here's what I believe. And now, for the rest of the paper or the essay, I'm going to walk you through how I got there, just like Columbo did. I'm going to show you how I put all these pieces of evidence together to figure out that conclusion. But I told you at the start what the conclusion was. Okay. Other questions? If not, then let's turn to some real examples of student writing. These are from students I've had in the past. I've anonymized them. No, I would never show you these so that someone should be ashamed. These are perfectly fine. Writing it just could be a lot better. And what I want us to do is take a look at some of these paragraphs and have you figure out what's weak in them and how they could be better. Professor Jaskoski, do you want to?
Yep, I have this
Okay.
intro.
So intro. Okay. Who would like to be a reader and let us hear this one out loud? Anybody want to give us this?
Study of war customarily analyzes the tools of the trade. From the musket to the machine gun and to the advent of nuclear arms, the history of war is replete with examples of the impact of innovative weaponry on armed conflict. While important, grasping the nature of weapons in war will not itself provide a thorough understanding of how and why wars occur. To understand how and why wars occur requires knowledge of the ideas and cultural trends that lead nations to war. Since the late 18th century, modern political history has been marked by the development of three potent and influential ideas: free trade, democracy, and nationalism. An understanding of the impact of free trade, democracy, and nationalism as causes of war in the modern world will demonstrate that how ideas matter more than weapons in modern military and political history.
I left that typo in.
Okay. So that's the very first thing you should never do, is have a grammatical mistake or some kind of typo, especially in your first paragraph. All right, let's break this apart. Tell me, what are the many problems with this opening paragraph?
It kind of goes off about weapons to begin with. It seems like weapons has nothing to do with what his core argument is. His core argument is going to be about his diplomacy, or democracy, free trade, and nationalism. It has nothing to do with weapons, so why is weapons even?
Good. Okay, so he buried the lead, so we don't get his main argument right at the front. We have to try and figure out what it is. It's lower down. What else? Good.
It also didn't expand on that argument. So it says that these three things were mattered in creation of war, but it doesn't really explain how, even a basic idea of how that links together and how he's going to prove that in the following page.
Okay, now given it is the opening paragraph, so there's a limit to how much we want him to expand. The rest of the essay will probably expand on it. But yes, you have a point in that maybe he could give us some hint as to how that's going to be relevant. Good. Okay, very good. Next. What else is wrong here?
The language is a little bit repetitive.
Repetitive. It is very repetitive, actually. I think not a little bit. Very good. Some of the ideas are just stated over and over. Good. What else?
He's stating some very obvious things, like war isn't caused because of the weapons. Stuff that doesn't need to.
Okay, so we could cut out the obviousness. Okay, good. What else?
His thesis isn't as straightforward. He just wants to say free trade united and nationalism called war.
Okay.
That could be said like that, not that.
Excellent paring down. So it's not concise, and it doesn't get to the point right away. There's a much simpler way of saying what he wants to say. Good. Other things?
I think the strongest statement is right at the beginning, and that's not his thesis at all.
Ah,
About guns.
okay.
He's really into guns, but that's not his
Okay.
It's his counterexample of what he's trying to disprove, but really finally ends with what he's trying to prove, but doesn't actually just state it.
Right. Okay, good. So the writer is really into guns, but that's not exactly what he wants to talk about. Very good. Okay. I think there's more, but we've gotten the main problems. Let's look at one way of rewriting it. Now, what I've done, let's switch to the next slide, is to try to stick with the author's own words rather than putting my own rewrite on it. All I've really done is stripped away stuff. So who wants to read this one? Anybody?
Weapons do not cause wars. Ideas are what drive men to take up arms.
Modern political history has been marked by the development of three potent and influential ideas: free trade, democracy, and nationalism. Each of these concepts present more formative war than you must get them. Very good. Okay. Good.
All right. What's different about this? What's better? It could be improved still more. But tell me what you see that's different. It's more straightforward. Okay, good.
A lot shorter.
A lot shorter, which is helpful. Okay, we don't get lost as easily. Good, okay. What else? The sentences themselves are shorter, so it's easier to follow, right?
Even though you talk about the weapons and guns, bring the actual thesis to the forefront. Keep that as
Right.
a subject rather than, yeah.
Exactly, right. So we put the thesis right up front. Good, okay. Yeah. And it's,
Also, the person talks about, like, one of the counter-arguments would be if there's a lot of weapons available, wars will occur. It kind of counters that in the beginning.
okay, okay, good. So it's almost a preemptive strike in that sense. It counters an argument before it even occurs. Good, okay. Anything else you notice? No typos, good, thanks, I tried. Okay. And so we've got crisp, lucid, and I hope defensible. And any other comments? Let me ask then, how could this be made even stronger? Any thoughts on how to improve this?
If there was some indication of what linking free trade, democracy, nationalism is something you want to hear about,
Okay, maybe.
bringing the high concepts down.
Okay. That might come in subsequently in the body of the essay. Okay.
Would this be considered too short? I mean, I always feel like I need to flesh things out more in an intro, but if this was your opening paragraph, would that be your entire opening paragraph, just 3 sentences?
Again, I would know my audience and know the professor you're writing for. If it were for me, I'd think it's great. If you can say exactly what you want to say and need to say in the shortest amount of space, I think most people will be grateful to you, and they will really thank you. we often have this need, or that we think that we have to flesh things out, which is important. We do need to flesh out our ideas and our arguments. The problem comes when we flesh them out with words that are unnecessary, okay, or we flesh them out in ways that just meander and distract. That's what I think the first example was doing. Okay, that was wasteful fleshing out. What we want is real meat on the bone. Okay, good. Okay, you could even, if you were to rewrite it, maybe just take a. How would you rewrite the very first sentence?
I would just take it out.
Take it out altogether.
If I was writing this, I would just take the first sentence out, and I'd take the last sentence out, and just try to make the last sentence something about fomenting war fit in with that middle sentence. You just take the first and last sentence.
We could just reduce this to a. We could just make this a single symbol, like the artist formerly known as Prince. You know, that would really cut it down. Okay. Right. No, you're right. Okay. Obviously, there has to be a limit to the cutting out, right? So you want to pare down.
I'll take everything else. I'll just take everything else about weapons. I'll take that.
Okay.
That all out. So
Okay.
it's necessary.
Okay, that's probably a good idea. So you'd want to maybe lead with ideas cause wars or something like that, and then say democracy or whatever, free trade, whatever the things are. Go straight to that. Okay, that's good. That's one way. Anybody else with thoughts or suggestions? How to rewrite it?
It's good enough for me.
Okay. When it's good enough for you, that's good. But show it to someone else before you submit it. Get some second or third opinions, if you're allowed to, if they permit you to share your work. Okay, good. Let's take a look at something else. Professor Jaskoski? Reasonably good. Okay. Who wants to read this out? Nice and loud and clear.
By reviewing the ideas of free trade, democracy, and nationalism, it is apparent that ideas
We've got to build a collaborative relationship between DOD and state civil authorities so that the DOD's response can be improved. The thesis argues that it is critical for community Title 10 forces and state civil authorities to build a collaborative relationship. The thesis examines the historical evolution of this relationship, identifying distinct phases to which it passed. It analyzes how and why this relationship evolved from collaboration and ambiguity. The thesis then examines the responses to Hurricanes Andrew and Katrina and shows how the Trump relationship slowed DOD's response. Finally, I offer also recommendations for improving DOD and state cooperation.
Okay, before we break this down, let me get a quick hand count. Just raise your hand, someone will count for me. How many people are going to be writing a thesis while here? Okay, good. Then this was a well-chosen example. Now let's figure out what makes this a reasonably good thesis introduction here. What do you find here was probably good?
we know exactly what the subject is and what the journey that the author wants to take us.
We know the subject. We know the journey, where the author wants to take us. What does that mean, we know the journey? What does that mean? Put that in another way.
Brought up the idea of this relationship. It's going to discuss historical evolution, some phases that it passed through, and then give us examples with Hurricane Andrew and Katrina, and then offer some policy recommendations,
Exactly.
presumably based upon that foundation.
Right. So in one paragraph, he's really laid out for us what's going to happen. And in a not too boring way, I'd say. I'd say it's clear, and we're not falling asleep. Okay. It doesn't meander. Good. What else? What else is positive about this?
It's right up front.
Right up front.
The first thing is the thesis of the whole paper. So.
Yeah. Good. Thesis right up front. We know what the argument is. Good. Critical. Next.
He uses active voice.
Active voice.
It's not too long. It's very crisp.
Crisp. Good. Exactly. Active. Crisp. Go on. On topic. Right. Anything else? What's that? Okay, he chooses to use the thesis will do, which is what most people do. It's perfectly acceptable. He could also say, I will show and I will argue. That would be my preference, but it doesn't matter. It's fine, whatever. Yes, yes. So that is, I liked that, personally. It broke it up a little bit, made it a little more interesting. Okay, good. Anything else? He also tells us, I just want to underline what was already said, tells us about some concrete examples he's going to give about Hurricane Katrina and Andrew, and then tells us at the end, I'm going to give you some policy recommendations. So we really know what to expect in this thesis. Okay, good. If you can do something like that in your thesis opening, that would be a really good start. You can be even stronger than this, but these are some things to think about and look for and strive for when you craft your thesis thing. Now, I think what we'll do is not do the final slide I had there. Instead, why don't we let Professor Jaskoski talk about what she wants to talk about, and if we have time at the end, I'll see if we can add on some more things about filling the blank space. Okay, great. Thanks for that. Let's turn it over to Professor Jaskoski.
Thank you. So I just want to talk a little bit more about the content of your papers or theses, or exam answers for essay answers also. This could be relevant. And then I also want to provide some information about the nuts and bolts of the writing process and what I call a four-draft process, getting you from a white page, a blank screen, to something you could potentially hand in for a class. So in terms of content, again, the social sciences, we're all about causal arguments. Why did something happen? I'm going to explain why something happened. And of course, for our papers, our theses here, we have to do something more than just regurgitate what's already there. We have to add. So what can we add? So here are some tips on things you can think about in terms of actual paper topics. You might take a theory out there and apply it to a new case. Okay, so you've read a theory that's built on the French, the Chinese, the Russian revolutions. You want to see, does it apply to the Iranian Revolution? That's a paper. I'm going to take this theory and apply it to a new case, see if it works. What if it doesn't work? Maybe you'll propose a different theory. Okay, maybe you'll alter the original theory to explain the Iranian case. Or you might conclude something about the theory. You might say, okay, it doesn't work for the Iranian case. This theory that I've used from the Russian, Chinese, and French revolutions can only apply to this kind of case. And you might kind of lay out the characteristics of a case and say why Iran doesn't work. This is all analysis. These would be kind of valid paper topics for a lot of professors. You might take, instead of applying just one theory to a new case, you may take two theories out there and weigh them. Which one works better for explaining the outcome in Iran or in China, in Cuba? Okay, you may take two theories and combine them. If I combine these two theories, can I come up with a better theory for explaining a certain case? Okay, so these are some things you might do for your paper. Okay, so that's one piece of content I wanted to talk about. On content, after your introduction, you have your introduction, a beautiful introduction. What's the first section of your paper after the introduction? Any guesses? If we have a formula for your paper, you're writing causal arguments. What's that first section following the introduction? Even before the literature review. Maybe methodology. Okay, these are all good, actually. Literature review, methodology. What I like to see is kind of the first piece of the content of the body of the paper is the outcome that you're trying to explain. Okay, if you're explaining revolution, you're going to define what you mean by revolution, drawing on definitions in the literature, and maybe altering them if you don't like them, but certainly grounding it in the literature. Define what's a revolution, and then describe what happened. What was the French Revolution and the Chinese Revolution, the Iranian Revolution? Whatever cases you're explaining, you actually describe the outcome. Don't spend half the paper on this, but this is an important piece of the paper. It's going to ground the rest of your analysis, and the rest of the paper is about explaining why it happened, or why he said it happened versus why she said it happened. Okay? So that's the outcome. I want to just say a couple things about what the outcome is not. Okay, so I'm talking about something. What is your outcome? Your outcome is something that has happened or is happening. And you can find information about those events that have happened or that did happen, and you're describing what happened or what is happening. Okay, this is your outcome. Your outcome is not normative. What's normative? Normative is what is good, what's wrong, what's right, what should be. These are normative claims, value claims, okay? This is not your outcome. You may make some value claims that democracy is good and this topic's important because we want democracy, or revolutions are terrible, or revolutions are wonderful. You may have some of those claims in your paper. Keep them to the introduction or the conclusion. Don't get them mixed up in your analysis. What's good, bad, right, wrong, that's not analysis. That's your kind of perspective. And keep it to the intro, the conclusion, keep it really short. So your outcome's not about what's good, bad, right, or wrong. Okay? Your outcome's also not predictions. Okay? You're analyzing stuff that's happened, and you can collect information about it. You're going to go to the library, research on something. You can't research something that hasn't happened yet. Your outcome is not a prediction. Okay. Do you want to make predictions? If you do, fine. Keep it to the conclusion, the very end, make it really small. Because you're not going to, that's not where you show your analytic capability in grad school. Okay. The predictions kind of keep them to the end, keep them separate. And then finally, policy recommendations. Unless you're taking a policy-making class, any policy recommendations also should be kept to the end, and they should be short. You're analyzing what's happened, not what the steps that should be taken to get somewhere. Okay. Again, if you're taking a policy-making class, absolutely, the paper's about a policy recommendation. But most classes here are not. So again, if you want to make normative claims, predictions, or policy recommendations, fine, but keep them separate from the analysis, keep them short, and put them in the introduction or the conclusion. That's my general advice, and these are things that I see students slipping into normative language a lot in my classes, so that's why I wanted to mention that. Okay, so that's kind of some points on the content of your paper. In terms of the nuts and bolts of drafting a paper for a class or a thesis, I'm going to walk through briefly what I call a 4-draft process. And this will get you from nothing to something you should be able to hand in for your class. Before you sit down and write anything, of course, as Dr. Shore said, you need a plan. You need to know generally what you want to say, what you want to argue, the general shape of your paper, so you have a rough outline at least. Okay, you sit down. The first 2 drafts, I call them the 0 draft and the first draft. Okay, you're going to write these together. You're going to write a chunk of the 0 draft, revise it, and have a piece of the first draft. Take a break, come back to the computer, write a little bit more of your 0 draft, revise it quickly, and have the first draft. So by the end of your first, you're going to end up with a complete draft of your paper, and it will be your first draft. So why am I talking about writing a chunk and calling it the 0 draft and then revising it and call it the first draft? These are 2 different drafts, really. You're going to sit down. This 0 draft you're writing for yourself. You would never show it to anyone. It's actually so messy that if you leave your computer and come back a day later or even an hour later, you might not understand what you just wrote. Okay? So you're going to write a chunk of this 0 draft. This 0 draft is not brainstorming. You kind of know where you're going generally, but it's very messy. This is where you put summaries of pieces of the readings that you think are important, and you connect them with the ideas that you've had to kind of link them together. Be sure to reference page numbers and authors, even at this stage. You don't want to have to dig back into your sources. So you're summarizing key arguments and linking them together with your ideas. This is where you put down your ideas. You don't worry if you have run-on sentences at this point. You don't worry if you have complete sentences. You don't worry if you're using the same word 6 times in a paragraph. You don't worry if you don't have paragraphs. Okay, this is very messy. This is your 0 draft, and this is the way to get past that blank computer screen. There's no pressure to make it look good. Okay, don't do this for more than a few pages. It's so messy, again, it's going to be hard for you to go back and know what you were doing. So do this for a half a page, a few pages, then go back, stay in your seat, stay in front of that computer screen, and revise it, okay? This is where you revise it, make sure it's in complete sentences, make sure that it makes some kind of sense. Okay, so you're going to end up with a couple pages, call it your first draft of that section. And you get up, you leave your computer, you might go to class, you might work on another paper, you might do something else, come back, and this is how you work through the first version of your paper. This really messy writing cleaned up slightly. So you have this first draft now. You want to take at least a day. Actually, but before I move on to the second draft, First draft. Okay, in terms of what you're writing, write the easiest sections first. Okay, what are the easiest sections? Maybe it's the literature review. Okay, you know where you're going, you know what gap in the literature you're going to fill, you know the problem with the literature. So you sit down, you might write your literature review. You might write your methods discussion. You might write the description of the outcome. This is going to be the first section of your paper anyway. It's going to ground the discussion. You just need to describe it. You don't you need to draw on the sources to describe what are the key events in the French Revolution that you want to be focusing on. So these are the easier sections to start with. Make sure that you set manageable goals for each writing session. Again, it's less overwhelming that way. Your goal is to describe a piece of the French Revolution today. Okay, that's manageable. Your goal is not to write the entire 30-page paper on the weekend, for instance. Go back and forth between your writing, this 0-1 draft, and your outline. Okay, don't spend too much time on a perfect outline. I have a friend, no joke, she spent a year writing a perfect dissertation outline. Okay, went back to kind of fill it in to write the whole dissertation. Her dissertation was nothing like that perfect, polished outline. Don't spend time on a polished outline. Dive into the readings, your writing, your argument, the nuts and bolts of the nitty-gritty of the argument, and you're going to end up with something like the outline, but you're definitely going to take some turns you didn't anticipate. Okay, so don't waste too much time on the perfect outline. Also, don't spend too much time on any one section or too many pages. If the assignment is 25 pages, you don't want to end up with 50 pages and then have to cut back. It's just not efficient. You have too many classes to be worrying about that. Okay, and then a final tip for this 0-1 draft. It's called parking on the downhill. Park on the downhill. When you get up to leave your computer, whether it's for an hour or a week, write notes to yourself about where you're going next. Okay, this is parking on the downhill so that it's not overwhelming to have to sit down, open that document, and figure out where you are, where you're going, what next, how to fill the next blank page. Okay, these are going to be notes to yourself about the next book that you're going to dive into to look at. Notes to yourself about the 4 next points you want to make, but you don't yet have the evidence or you just don't have time to write it all down. Notes about the evidence you do have where you're just sketching out, these are the 4 points I want to make. These are the 3 articles I want to draw on. Notes to yourself about where to go next. Always park on the downhill. Okay, so you have this 0-1 draft, the second draft. Okay, if you do a good job on the second draft, it'll be clear enough to show to someone else. This is the first draft where it's actually going to communicate to someone else something. This is beyond, okay, but this is not the draft you're going to hand into your professor. Tips for revising this second draft. Again, you're in front of your computer generally for this second draft. Don't always start revising at the beginning of the paper. Okay, you want to start each section with fresh eyes. So start in the middle one day, start at the end one day, start at the beginning one day. Try copying and pasting all of your headings and topic sentences into a separate document and read through it. Okay, do all of those topic sentences and headings lead you logically through your argument and through the points that you're making. If they don't, go back, switch around sections, rewrite section headings and topic sentences to kind of tie the whole paper together. After you have revised and you have the second draft, write an abstract in a half page or less summarizing your paper. And based on that, you may see some ways that you can clarify the argument further by, again, shifting around sections. Maybe there's a point that's missing. Maybe when you look at the abstract, there's kind of a logical gap in your reasoning, and you're going to have to write a new section or something. So these are some tips. So if you have a solid draft number 2, print it off. And I would recommend trading drafts with a colleague. As Dr. Shore said, have someone else read it, have someone else give you feedback, if it's allowed. Of course, if it's an exam where you're supposed to work independently, you wouldn't do this. Trade drafts, give feedback. Okay, so you have your printed off, I'm going to call it draft number 2. You've printed it off. Now you're going to produce draft number 3. And really, this is your 4th draft because we had draft 0 at the beginning. Okay, so draft number 3, you've printed off draft 2. This is the draft where you go line by line, sentence by sentence, and read the paper out loud. Okay, I'm not kidding. Read your paper out loud, slowly to you, to yourself, line by line, sentence by sentence, and ask yourself, is it clear? Okay, number one, is it clear? We write for clarity above all. Does one sentence logically follow the next? Does the first sentence in the paragraph capture the main point of that paragraph? Does the first paragraph of a section capture the main point of that section? And finally, are there extra sentences or words that you can get rid of? And get rid of them. And generally, when starting from a hard copy of what we can call the second draft, but for me it's usually the 10th draft, doing this exercise, I end up getting rid of at least a third of my text this way. Really cut out what's not necessary. And it'll be sharp and it'll communicate much better. Okay, so you've gone with your hard copy draft, you've marked it up, inserted the changes. You now have your third draft. Not a perfect draft, but if you did those first drafts very efficiently, then you now have something you might turn into your professor. Never turn into something to a professor that you have not printed off and read in hard copy. I've never known someone to be able to edit as well on the computer as they do on hard copy. So those are my tips. Any questions on anything I just said? Obviously, there's many different ways to write. This is the process I use. I call it a 4-draft rule. Really, it's always more than 4 drafts. However, when you have so many classes, so much going on at one time, it is about efficiency. You get as far as you can in 4 drafts, and any more time to do additional editing is just kind of candy, in a sense, if you have more time. Yes?
You spoke about policy recommendations. They should be at the end when you're talking about content.
Yep.
And you seem to kind of downplay that maybe that doesn't have a place in an academic paper. Is that an accurate statement? Or, I mean, I guess what I'm coming from is you can have an academic paper which has a thesis.
Yep.
But in the end, the translation between thesis and actual action sometimes is very difficult. And in my mind, it would be valuable to have
Yes.
recommendations.
Yes, and thank you for asking that. Absolutely critical to have policy recommendations, and so much nicer if they're linked to really good research about what's happened, rather than just recommendations based on nothing, right? No, absolutely. Generally, I'd say most of my thesis students, if not all, I think most of them have had policy recommendations in their theses, and it's always at the end, not necessarily in the conclusion, but in a last chapter before the conclusion. That would be the most they would spend on policy recommendations. But absolutely, the majority is based on research, what has happened, and then building on that and drawing explicit connections from that to policy recommendations. Beautiful. But if they mix up the policy recommendations throughout the research, the discussion of the research, it's muddled, it's messy, it's sloppy. Okay, so as long as it's separate, then I'm good with it. If it's separate and at the end, it's only after we've learned lessons from the past and what's going on would we even dare start to talk about policy recommendations. That's my perspective. I don't teach policy making. So now, for those of you, a policy making class will have a totally different spin and goals for the writing, and so I don't want to speak to that. Is that okay?
It seems like it's difficult to remove emotion from the paper and make a logical academic argument and have policy in there. That's what I start to get is the reason why people tell you to stay away from it. You can put it at the end, but you have to start with an academically founded argument that's based off of research as opposed to, you call it normative, but arguments that might elicit an emotional response from the reader that's not just academic.
Yeah. Okay. So 2 things. One is policy recommendations. If any of us sit down and read policy recommendations that don't start with the facts of what has happened somewhere, then we're wondering, well, where are these recommendations coming from? What are they grounded on? In nothing, right? Okay. So we want, just as smart readers, we want to have the facts first, and then some kind of linkage and saying, well, based on these facts, these are the lessons learned, and if we were going to go in and do this again, and talk about asparagus in another country in the Andes, what would, policy recommendations are, look at the topography, look at the climate, Find out if asparagus has ever been grown in that area before. These are my policy recommendations. Now, if someone just started with that, you'd be like, what are you talking about? No, they have to first describe the failure in Peru. Okay? Okay, so that's policy rec. In terms of normative, what's good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong? Okay, let's take the Cuban Revolution. Explaining why the Cuban Revolution happened. This could be valuable for someone whether they like what happened in Cuba or hate what happened in Cuba, okay? Whether you're pro-Castro or anti-Castro, a good thesis explaining why the Cuban Revolution happened would be useful. Anti-Castro person takes it and says, lessons learned, what to stop from happening again. The pro-Castro person says, this is a guidebook for what we need to repeat everywhere else in the world, okay? But they can both take the same thesis and get a lot out of it. It's not just an academic exercise, but it's about what has happened and why, and then they can take from it the lessons they want. Is that okay? Okay. Zach, go ahead. Excuse me. Sorry, what?
How are we doing on time?
Oh, thank you. It's 1 minute to 3.
Okay. How about 1 minute's worth of quick further tips to just piggyback on what Professor Jaskoski has said. Let's see. For filling the blank space, I would say start by keeping your research question down to 6 or 8 words, not more than 8 words. If you can force yourself to get down to an 8-word or fewer question, you will really help yourself, because this will keep you constantly focused. Whenever you're writing a paragraph or a section or a chapter, you can keep asking yourself, wait, is what I'm writing advancing, helping to answer the question I posed? And if it's not, stop doing it. Don't waste your time, because all you need to do is advance your argument. Support it, defend it, make it persuasive, give us the evidence. Keep that tight, focused question in mind. So, for example, my first book was called What Hitler Knew, and the question was, how did Hitler make decisions? 5. And then if you're writing a thesis or a book, each chapter should have its own question of not more than 8 words. And that will also keep that chapter focused. So, for example, I had a chapter, why did Hitler remilitarize the Rhine? After each question, you can then elaborate it, okay? And that will help you be clearer and even more focused. So, not just how did Hitler make decisions, but then you'd write more specifically, how did the Nazi regime make decisions in the pre-war period from 1933 to 39? And even more specifically than that, we're just looking at foreign policy decisions and certain critically important foreign policy decisions. The more narrowly focused you can get, the easier it will be to fill the blank space, because you'll know exactly what you need to do to answer that question. And the way that you'll know is you question your question. This is key. Start taking a really thoughtful look at the question you're posing and say, well, what are the steps someone would need to take to answer that question? So if it's, why did Hitler remilitarize the Rhine? Well, first, you might need a section that would give background and explain, what does that mean? Why was the Rhineland demilitarized? Well, it was a condition of the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, so you'd write a little bit about that and explain the context. Then you'd say, well, why should it even have been a question? He violated the terms of Versailles. Why is this a question? Well, was he able to do it? Did Germany have the capacity to send troops? I need to figure out, did they? Were they worried about an Allied response? On and on. You can keep coming up with questions to your question that will lead you towards filling the blank space. That's how you approach any academic work. Question your question and say, what are the logical steps I need to take to answer the question I've posed at the beginning? And then you wrap it all up with the punchy conclusions that we've talked about. If you can, this is one other helpful tip that I think makes academic writing more interesting and valuable, try to link it to the larger significance. You may be writing about a very narrow, specific question, and that doesn't mean that it is not relevant to something larger. Try and show us why. Take, for example, the Trachtenberg article we were reading. Why should we care so much about the interpretations of World War I? What Trachtenberg did was he linked it to the larger significance of how we understand strategy and warfare. And he said our understanding of the First World War affects how we think about the causes of other wars. That's what you want to do. Link it, if you can, your topic, to some larger, bigger question than the narrow one you focused on. Okay, there's a lot more that can be said about this, but I think those are the very basics. Any questions at this point? Because we have to wrap up, but happy to entertain any final questions. Anybody? Okay, if not, then I think we can thank you very much for coming. Appreciate your time, and good luck.